last honest thing I drew before the world broke was a contour line. I need you to understand what that means. A contour line is a promise. It says, at this elevation, the Earth is here. Not approximately, not metaphorically, here. And every line I'd drawn in 11 years at the Oregon Department of Forestry had been measured, verified, and filed in a building on Summer Street in Salem that doesn't exist anymore. I was a cartographer, GIS specialist technically, but cartographer is what I wrote on rental applications because it made landlords think I was interesting instead of broke. I spent my professional life translating ground truth into symbols other people could trust with their lives. Trail distances, slope grades, water crossings, fire boundaries. My name went on maps that smoke jumpers carried into burning forests. If I got a drainage wrong, someone walked into a canyon expecting a creek and found a cliff. That precision ate my marriage. Not all at once. Slowly, the way water finds a crack. Deirdre used to say I corrected her the way I corrected a survey, with the quiet confidence of someone who believed accuracy was the same as love. She wasn't wrong. She left in March, took our 9-year-old, moved to her mother's in Ashland. I stayed in the duplex near Minto Brown Park with a drafting table I'd bought at Surplus, and a retriever named Sextant who'd earned his name by once knocking my actual sextant off that table and into a bowl of oatmeal. I was 41. I had a government salary, joint custody every other weekend, a dog who ate socks, and the ability to read terrain the way some people read faces. Not just what was there, but what the shape implied about what wasn't. That last part is the only reason I'm still here. It was October 14th, a Tuesday, and I was digitizing hand-annotated fire perimeter maps from the 2020 Labor Day fires when my colleague Marcus Obi slid a coffee across my desk and said the Coast Guard had closed the mouth of the Columbia. I didn't look up. Marcus was the office conspiracy theorist, the kind of man who forwarded articles about seed vaults and solar flares with subject lines like, just in case. Harmless, exhausting. Some kind of contamination event, he said. They're calling it neurological. I told him contamination events don't close shipping lanes and went back to my screen. He stood there another 4 seconds. I know because I counted the way I count everything. Reflexively, precisely, without deciding to. Then he set something on my desk beside the coffee. A folded section of USGS quad map. Brighton Bush Hot Springs Quadrangle, 7.5-minute series. Standard topographic sheet, except someone had drawn on it in mechanical pencil. Neat, deliberate annotations in a hand I didn't recognize. Elevation corrections, spring locations. And in the southeast corner, near an unnamed drainage between two ridgelines that the original survey showed as unimproved forest, a small rectangle labeled in block letters, Site 19, FEMA/DOD Continuity Cache, DCOM 2004. I looked up. Marcus was already walking away. Found it in a file cabinet they told me to empty. Thought you'd appreciate the cartographic anomaly. A cartographic anomaly. That's what I thought it was. That's what I told myself it was while I held the map under my desk lamp and examined the line work. Whoever had drawn those annotations knew what they were doing. The contour corrections were accurate to the surrounding terrain. The spring symbols used proper USGS convention, small blue circles with flow arrows. The rectangle had dimensions noted, 40 by 60 feet. There was a second label beneath the first, smaller, almost apologetic. Not to be transferred to digital database. Paper only. I should have filed it. I should have put it in the anomaly folder where we kept survey discrepancies for eventual field verification. and forgotten about it the way I forgot about most things that weren't my daughter or my dog or the quiet discipline of making the earth legible. I put it in my jacket pocket instead. 3 days later, the governor declared a state of emergency. 4 days after that, I couldn't reach Deirdre. I need to be precise about the timeline, because precision is the only thing I have left to offer. And if I lose that, I'm just a man talking. October 14th. Marcus brings the map. October 15th through 17th. The news runs the contamination story. A neurotropic pathogen, they called it. Origin unclear. Affecting motor function and cognitive processing in a way that made the infected aggressive, uncoordinated, and impossible to reason with. Portland saw the first confirmed cases on the 16th. By the 18th, the National Guard was staging on I-5, and the word zombie appeared in a governor's press conference for the first time in American history. She said it with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd spent her career in policy and now had to say a word that belonged in a teenager's video game. October 19th, they closed the office. October 20th, the cell networks went intermittent. October 21st, I drove to Ashland. I made it as far as Roseburg. The highway south was a parking lot of abandoned vehicles and military checkpoints that weren't checking anything anymore. Just orange cones and empty Humvees and a silence that had texture, like humidity, like something you had to push through. I saw my first infected near Canyonville. A woman in a Safeway uniform walking the median strip with her left arm hanging at an angle that meant the shoulder was dislocated or broken. And her head turning with that mechanical regularity I'd later learned to recognize as the scanning behavior. She didn't come toward me. Not then. I turned around anyway. Back in Salem, I tried Deirdre's phone 11 more times. The line connected twice. No voice on the other end, just ambient sound. Traffic maybe, or movement. I couldn't tell if the phone was in her hand or on the ground. The map was still in my jacket. I pulled it out at 2 a.m. on October 23rd, sitting on the kitchen floor with Sexton's head on my thigh and a flashlight because the power had been cycling on and off since midnight. I measured the coordinates against a digital elevation model I still had cached on my laptop. The site was in the Willamette National Forest, about 4 miles off Forest Road 46, in terrain I'd mapped peripherally during the 2020 fire surveys. Steep, volcanic soil, old-growth Douglas fir with canopy so dense the Forest Service had trouble getting accurate LiDAR returns. The kind of country that hid things. A FEMA continuity cache. I knew what those were. During the Cold War, the federal government had seeded the landscape with emergency supply points, some as simple as buried shipping containers, others as complex as small underground facilities with independent water and ventilation. Most had been decommissioned, stripped, or simply forgotten. A few appeared on classified facility inventories. Fewer still had been annotated on paper maps by someone who'd found one in the field and had the discipline to mark it properly without entering it into any digital system. Paper only. Whoever had drawn those annotations understood that digital data could be searched. Paper, filed in the wrong cabinet, disappeared. I made my decision the way I made all decisions, by measuring what I knew against what I didn't. What I knew. Salem would become untenable within days. The infected were spreading south along the I-5 corridor, following population density the way water follows gravity. My daughter was 180 miles away, behind a wall of collapsed infrastructure, and I couldn't reach her. What I didn't know, whether the site existed, whether it contained anything useful, whether the 4 miles of unmaintained forest road were passable. I knew the terrain, though. I'd drawn it. I left Salem at 4:15 a.m. On October 24th, in a state vehicle I technically no longer had authorization to drive, a 2018 Ford F-150 with a brush guard and a department decal I'd later peel off with a putty knife. Sextant rode shotgun. I'd spent the previous 18 hours filling the truck bed with everything I could carry from my duplex and a single stop at a Bi-Mart that was open but unstaffed, the automatic doors cycling on an empty building. Here is what I took. I am going to be specific because the decisions I made in those 18 hours determined whether I lived or died, and I want you to judge them honestly. 12 cases of bottled water, roughly 48 gallons. At a gallon a day, that was 7 weeks for one person. 2 50-pound bags of white rice and one of pinto beans from a restaurant supply store I broke into on Lancaster Drive. The door was already open, the owner's truck still running in the lot. A 12-gauge Remington 870 from the gun safe at my neighbor's house. Bill Kessler had evacuated 2 days earlier and left me the combination on a sticky note under my doormat. 60 shells, mix of buckshot and slugs, a first aid kit from the department truck, 6 bottles of ibuprofen from the Bi-Mart pharmacy counter. My camping gear, a 4-season tent, a sleeping bag rated to 15 degrees, a backpacking stove with 4 fuel canisters, 2 USGS quad maps covering the Brighton-Bush area, a compass, my GPS unit, which I packed but didn't trust, because I knew the satellite constellation had been degrading since the military started prioritizing other signals. Sextant's food, a 40-pound bag of kibble, a water filter rated for 100,000 gallons that I'd bought for backpacking trips I never took, a hand crank radio. What I didn't take, enough ammunition, a proper medical kit, antibiotics, cold weather clothing beyond what I owned, a generator, fuel beyond what was in the truck's tank, and 2 5-gallon jerry cans I'd filled at the last functioning station in Staten. I drove east on Highway 22 toward Detroit Lake as the sun came up behind cloud cover so uniform it looked like a ceiling. The road was mostly empty. The exodus had gone south and west toward the coast, toward California. Nobody was driving into the mountains in October, except people who were lost, or people who had a destination they weren't sharing. Forest Road 46 branched south off Highway 22, about 6 miles past the Detroit Lake Marina. The pavement ended after 2 miles. The gravel held for another 3. Then it was packed dirt, rutted from the previous winter's runoff, narrowing until the dug fir canopy closed overhead and the truck's mirrors brushed sword fern on both sides. I navigated by contour. That's not a metaphor. I had the annotated map spread across the steering wheel, and I was reading the terrain the way I'd read it in the office, matching the shape of the ridgeline to the penciled contour lines, watching for the drainage pattern that would mark the unnamed creek running southeast, because the rectangle on the map sat 200 feet upslope from that creek on a bench of flat ground that had no business being flat in country this steep. Volcanic terracing. Basalt intrusions creating natural platforms in otherwise continuous slope. I'd mapped dozens of them. They were geologically unremarkable and perfectly suited for construction. Level, well-drained, concealed by terrain on 3 sides. I found the bench at 9:47 a.m. The vault was a concrete rectangle set into the hillside, with a steel blast door facing downslope, painted forest green and covered in 11 years of moss and needle litter. No signage, no fence, no road leading to it. Just a flat pad of poured concrete hidden behind a curtain of second-growth hemlock that had sprung up since the last timber operation in this drainage, which my maps told me was 1997. The door had a combination lock. Federal surplus, Sargent and Greenleaf. I tried the standard GSA default, 50-25-50, and the dial turned with the greased resistance of a mechanism that had been maintained more recently than 2004. Somebody had been here. The door weighed enough that I had to brace my boot against the frame and pull with both hands. Behind it was a second door, lighter, unlocked. Beyond that, darkness that smelled like concrete dust and something else. Something alive. Not alive the way a person is alive. Alive the way a system is alive. Moving air. I stood at the threshold with the Remington in one hand and a headlamp in the other and listened. The sound was mechanical. A low, rhythmic pulse I eventually identified as a ventilation fan running off stored power. Somewhere inside, a battery bank was feeding current to a circulation system designed to keep the air breathable in a sealed space. The fan had been running for years. The batteries should have been dead, which meant someone had replaced them, or the facility had a power source I couldn't yet identify. The space was larger than the map suggested. The entry corridor ran 20 feet straight back into the hillside before opening into a main chamber approximately 30 by 40 feet with a 10-foot ceiling. Poured concrete walls, steel I-beam supports, a floor sealed with industrial epoxy that still held a faint sheen under my headlamp. To the left, a smaller room with metal shelving. To the right, a narrow passage leading to what I'd later find was a mechanical space containing the ventilation system, a bank of deep cycle batteries, and the explanation for everything. A buried propane tank feeding a whisper-quiet generator through a line that ran through the concrete wall. The propane gauge read 62%. Someone had not only maintained this facility, they had fueled it. The shelving room made me sit down. I don't mean I chose to sit. I mean my legs made a decision my brain hadn't authorized. 6 steel racks, floor to ceiling, stocked with military surplus MREs in cases still bearing lot numbers and inspection dates. Water purification tablets in sealed buckets. Medical supplies. Not first aid kit bandages, but field surgical kits, IV bags, antibiotics in vacuum-sealed packaging with expiration dates 5 years out. 2 cases of 5.56 NATO ammunition and one of 12 gauge. A shortwave radio, unpowered but intact. Wool blankets, sleeping pads, hand tools, a laminated binder on the middle shelf labeled Facility Operations Manual. Site 19 that I opened with the particular reverence of a man who has spent his life making documents and has just found one that might save him. The manual was typed, not printed, typed. On a typewriter with the particular irregularity of a Manuel Smith Corona, which I recognized because my grandfather had owned one. It contained operating procedures for every system, generator startup and shutdown, ventilation maintenance, water collection from the upslope spring via a buried gravity feed line I hadn't noticed, waste disposal protocols, and a section titled Capacity Assessment that stated the facility could sustain 4 persons for 180 days at minimal activity levels, or 2 persons for 1 year. 1 year. The final page was handwritten, different hand than the map annotations, looser, less precise. A note dated June 2019. If you found this place, you needed it. The combination has not changed because the people who assigned it forgot this site exists, and I never reminded them. I service the systems twice a year. I am not a survivalist. I am a man who spent his career preparing for emergencies that never arrived and lost his pension when the program was cut. This is the only thing I built that no one dismantled. Use it well. Leave it better than you found it. No name, no contact information, no further explanation. I brought Sexton in and closed both doors and sat in a concrete room under a mountain with a year's worth of supplies maintained by a ghost. And I did something I hadn't done since Deirdre told me she wanted the divorce. I unfolded the annotated map on the floor and traced the contour lines with my finger. Every one of them accurate. Every one of them drawn by someone whose discipline I recognized, because it was my own. And I let the scale of what I'd found settle into me the way elevation settles into a landscape. Not all at once, but through accumulation, through the slow, patient weight of what is actually there. Outside, through 6 inches of concrete and 2 steel doors, the world was ending. Down in the valley, along the highways, in the towns and cities I'd spent my career mapping, people were dying in ways that didn't belong in any cartographer's legend. I had found the one place no map was supposed to show. And within 9 days, I'd have to decide whether to put it on one. The woman arrived on day 6. I'd spent those first days doing what I do, surveying. I mapped the facility systems the way I'd map a watershed. Inputs, outputs, capacities, failure points. The spring-fed water line delivered approximately 8 gallons per day by gravity. The propane, at current generator load, would last 14 months. The MREs, recounted and inventoried, came to 1,440 individual meals, enough for one person eating twice daily for 2 years, or 4 people for 6 months. I logged everything in a notebook I'd brought from the office, because a cartographer without a notebook is just someone staring at dirt. Sextant, adapted to underground life, with the indifference of a creature whose primary concerns, food, warmth, proximity to his person, were met. He slept on a wool blanket near the generator room, where the mechanical hum seemed to comfort him the way engine noise comforts some dogs in cars. On the morning of day 6, I was outside filling water containers from the spring's surface outlet when Sexton's ears went flat against his skull. She came up the drainage from the south, following the creek, which meant she hadn't found the site by road. She'd found it by water. A short woman in her 50s, Filipino, carrying a child's school backpack and wearing rubber boots 2 sizes too large. Her left hand was wrapped in a dish towel, stiff with dried blood. She saw me before I could decide whether to step behind the hemlock screen, and she stopped 20 feet away and said, "I can see the door behind you, and I can smell propane, and I haven't eaten in 3 days. So if you're going to point that shotgun at me, I'd appreciate if you did it now so I can decide whether to keep walking." Her name was Celia Marcos. She'd been a charge nurse at Santiam Hospital in Staten until the hospital was overrun on day 2. The hand was a laceration from breaking a window during evacuation, not a bite. She showed me the wound without being asked, peeling back the towel with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd unwrapped 10,000 dressings and understood that proof outranked politeness. She'd walked 18 miles northeast into the mountains on Forest Service roads, sleeping in her car until the gas ran out. Then on foot, following drainages uphill because, she said, water flows down and people follow water down. So walking up meant walking away from people. The logic was sound enough that I recognized it as survival thinking rather than panic. I let her in. That was moral dilemma 1, and I want you to sit with it the way I sat with it, standing in October forest with a loaded shotgun and a wounded stranger and a concrete room behind me that one unsigned note said could sustain 4 people and simple division said could sustain 2 for much longer. Every person I admitted halved my timeline. Not metaphorically, mathematically. The numbers were the one thing I could read without ambiguity. And they said the safest thing was to lie. To tell her I was just passing through, that the door was locked, that there was nothing here. I am not a generous man. Deirdre would confirm this. I am a man who measures. But Celia looked at the door the way I look at a contour line, with the recognition of someone seeing exactly what is there. And I understood that lying to someone that precise would cost me more than food. She redressed her own hand with supplies from the medical stores, started a rotation schedule for the generator to conserve propane, and by day 8 had organized the MREs by caloric density in a system more efficient than mine. On day 12, she heard the boy. He was in the drainage below the spring, huddled under a basalt overhang with a black Labrador mix, who growled when Celia approached and then licked her hand when she knelt down and waited. The boy was maybe 13. Tall for his age, thin in a way that was recent, the kind of thinness that comes from a week of not enough rather than a lifetime of too little. He said his name was Orrin Park, and the dog was called Zip. And his parents had put him in the family Subaru outside Mahama with instructions to drive to his aunt's in Bend, and he'd made it 30 miles before the road ended in an overturned logging truck, and he'd been walking since. 13 years old, and he'd driven a car for the first time in his life on the day the world required it. I did the math. 4 people now. Because I counted Sextant and Zip in the resource allocation, having learned in my first week that feeding a dog was not optional but structural. The way feeding a pump is structural because the thing a dog provides cannot be replaced by any item on any shelf. 4 people. 1,280 remaining meals at our current consumption rate, approximately 320 days. Manageable. Not comfortable, but the comfort threshold had passed sometime around day 3 when I accepted I was living in a hole in a mountain, and my daughter was on the other side of a collapsed state. We settled into routine. Routine is what saves you. Not supplies, not weapons, not walls. Routine. The human mind will eat itself in an unfamiliar environment unless you give it a schedule to follow. And I built ours the way I'd build a map, systematically, with clear boundaries and consistent symbols. Morning, generator check, water collection, perimeter observation from the tree line above the vault entrance. Celia handled medical inventory and meal preparation. Orrin took charge of the dogs. Feeding, exercise in the screened area behind the hemlock curtain, monitoring Zip's persistent limp from a foxtail that had worked into his pad and that Celia extracted with forceps and veterinary patience on day 15. Afternoon. I mapped. I couldn't help it. I surveyed the surrounding terrain in expanding circles, recording water sources, game trails, sight lines, approach routes. I marked the locations of 3 other concrete pads I found within a mile of the vault. Remnants of the same Cold War program, stripped to bare slabs, useful only as confirmation that the area had been deliberately chosen for concealment. I drew everything in my notebook with the compulsive detail of a man who believes that if he can render the world accurately enough, the world will make sense. Evening, shortwave radio. Celia had gotten it operational on day 9 using batteries from the reserve stock, and every night at 8 o'clock, we sat in the main chamber and listened. Most frequencies were dead. A few carried automated emergency broadcasts on loop. FEMA messages directing survivors to staging points in Bend, Eugene, and Medford, none of which we could verify were still active. One frequency, 7.285 megahertz, carried a voice. A man identifying himself as Harlan, broadcasting from somewhere in the southern Cascades, giving situation reports in the flat cadence of someone who'd done military communications. His reports were specific. Road conditions, infected concentrations by area, weather forecasts he was apparently generating from a personal station. He never gave his exact location. He never asked for responses. He just talked every night for 12 minutes, and then the frequency went silent. Orrin listened to Harlan with a focus I recognized. The boy was mapping too, not terrain, information. He remembered every detail Harlan reported, cross-referenced it against previous broadcasts, and on day 20 produced a hand-drawn map of his own that plotted the infected concentrations Harlan had described against the road network with an accuracy that startled me. "My mom was a GIS analyst," he said, when I asked where he'd learned to draw like that. "For ODOT. For a full 10 seconds, I couldn't speak. Not because of grief. Because of recognition. The boy's mother had worked in a building I'd visited quarterly for data sharing meetings. It was possible I'd passed her in a hallway. It was possible our maps had been filed in the same database. These connections meant nothing and everything simultaneously, and I let them exist without trying to measure their weight. The 23rd night, Harlan's broadcast changed. "To anyone receiving on 7.285, he said, in a voice stripped of its usual steadiness. "National Guard forward operating base at Redmond Municipal Airport is active. Verified. I watched supply aircraft land this morning from my position on a ridgeline I am not going to identify. They are taking survivors. Screening is medical. No bites, no late-stage symptoms. They are flying people to a secure zone in Northern California. I don't know how long the window holds. Weather is moving. In from the Pacific, first major storm of the season. The models I'm running show it hitting the Cascades in 6 days. After that, mountain roads are done until spring. If you're above 3,000 feet and you're thinking about moving, you have 6 days. Harlan out." Celia turned off the radio and looked at me. The vault sat at 3,800 feet elevation. Redmond was 62 miles northeast, across the Cascade crest, through terrain I knew from 11 years of mapping. Volcanic plateaus, river gorges, forest roads that turned to mud in November and didn't dry until May. In a truck, on maintained roads, it was 90 minutes. On foot through compromised territory with a 13-year-old and 2 dogs and a woman whose hand was still healing, I estimated 5 days. Harlan said we had 6, 1 day of margin, in October in the Oregon Cascades, with a storm system approaching. That was moral dilemma 2, and it was worse than the first because both options were defensible and neither was safe. We could stay. The vault had food, water, power, shelter. We could survive the winter underground. I'd done the math. It worked, barely, if we reduced to 1,500 calories per day and the propane held, and nobody got sick and the ventilation system didn't fail, and Ningtak. And we didn't lose our minds in a concrete box for 5 months while the mountains froze above us. Or we could walk 62 miles to an airfield that a voice on a radio said was active, through territory we knew contained infected, in a window that one storm could close, stay in the known, move toward the possible. I spread my maps on the floor and started drawing the route. Celia sat beside me and said nothing for a long time. Then, "The boy needs to be around people. Not 3 people in a bunker. People." She was right. I'd watched Oren contract over 23 days. Not physically, but in some interior dimension I couldn't quantify. He spoke less. He drew his maps with the same precision, but his eyes had developed a fixed quality, a middle-distance focus that Celia identified clinically as the early presentation of dissociative withdrawal. He was 13. He needed a world that was bigger than a room. "We could send him with you," I said. "I could stay, maintain the vault for anyone else who finds it." She looked at me with the particular weariness of a woman who has spent her career watching people rationalize selfishness as a sacrifice. "You want to stay because staying is measurable. You know exactly what staying costs. You can't map what's out there, so you'd rather let me walk into it." I didn't answer because she was right about that too. We left on day 25. I spent day 24 doing the hardest thing I've ever done with a pencil. I sat at the table in the main chamber and I drew a map. Not a government map, not a professional product. A survival map. I drew the route from the vault to Forest Road 46 to Highway 22 to the network of forest roads crossing the Cascade Crest toward Redmond. I drew water sources, sheltered campsites, ridgeline routes that avoided valleys where the infected concentrated. I marked the vault's location with a clean black rectangle and labeled it with a combination and the word "Open." Then I made a copy. And another. I made 4 copies, each one hand-drawn, each one taking 40 minutes because accuracy is not something I can abbreviate. I sealed 3 in plastic bags from the medical supplies. I was putting the vault on a map. The anonymous builder had kept it hidden, had maintained it for years precisely because no database contained its coordinates, no digital record pointed to its steel door. The secrecy was the security, and I was undoing that with every pencil stroke. But a survival cache that no one can find saves no one. And a map that stays in one man's pocket is just a souvenir. I left 1 copy in the vault, pinned to the wall above the operations manual. I put 1 in my pack. The other 2 I planned to leave along the route at trail junctions, in shelters, anywhere a person moving through the mountains might find them. Every copy was a risk. Every copy was also an invitation. The math cut both ways. We locked the vault, but left the combination written on the inside of the outer door frame. Findable if you knew to look, invisible if you didn't. I put the facility operations manual on the table with a note in my neatest drafting hand. Propane at 58%. Generator runs on 6-hour cycles. Spring line freezes below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Manual valve in mechanical room must be closed to prevent pipe burst. Read the manual before you touch anything. G. Nakata. My name. On a note. In a place no map was supposed to show. I hadn't planned to sign it. My hand decided for me. The first day we covered 9 miles on Forest Road 46 and then the connecting road to Highway 22. Moving through old-growth forest that smelled like wet bark and decomposition and the particular mineral sweetness of volcanic soil in autumn. Sextant and Zip ranged ahead. And I learned something about dogs that first day that Orin already knew. They sense the infected before any human indicator registers. Zip would stop, ears rotating, nostrils dilating in a specific sequence. Scenting, then listening, then freezing. That gave us 30 to 40 seconds of warning. Enough to step off the road, find cover, wait. We saw infected 3 times that first day. All singles, all moving downslope along the road toward the valley, all displaying the characteristic gait. Arrhythmic, favoring one side, heads on that slow mechanical pivot. They didn't see us. Zip's warning system and the forest's density gave us margins I hadn't calculated. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 25 days. The validation of a map matching the territory. The second day we crossed Highway 22 at dawn and moved northeast on a forest road I'd selected for its elevation, staying above 3,500 feet, where population density before the outbreak had been 0. And the infected, following the gravitational logic of human settlement, remained sparse. Celia walked without complaint, but I could see the energy cost in her breathing by afternoon. The hand was healing well, but her reserves were depleted from 3 days of starvation before finding us. And 23 days of reduced calories in the vault hadn't rebuilt them. Orin carried more than his frame suggested he could. He'd fashioned a pack harness from paracord and a wool blanket that distributed the weight of his supplies across his shoulders and hips, with an efficiency that made me look at him differently. The boy solved problems spatially. He understood load-bearing the way I understood contouring, intuitively, structurally, as a property of the physical world that could be worked with rather than against. That second night, camped in a hollow below a ridgeline with no fire because fire was a beacon. Celia told me about the hospital. She told it flat. The way clinicians report, patient presented, intervention attempted, outcome observed. The infected had come in as patients first, admitted through the ER with neurological symptoms, confusion, motor impairment, aggression. They were triaged, restrained, sedated, standard protocol for agitated patients. Except the sedation didn't hold. And when it failed in a coordinated wave, as though the pathogen had synchronized them. 11 patients in restraints, breaking free within a 4-minute window across 3 floors. She lost 6 colleagues in the first hour. She left through a window. That was the laceration. I keep thinking about the restraints, she said. Whether we tied them correctly, whether that would have mattered. I told her it wouldn't have mattered. I know, she said. But the restraints are what I see. Day 3 of the traverse brought us to the spine of the Cascades, and the thing I'd been dreading since Harlan's broadcast. The Santiam Pass corridor. Highway 20 lay below us, and from our ridgeline position, I could see what the map couldn't tell me. The highway was blocked. Not by vehicles, not by military checkpoints, by infected. Dozens of them, visible as intermittent movement between the trees along a 2-mile stretch of road, clustering around an overturned fuel tanker that had created a bottleneck of abandoned cars. They weren't moving with purpose. They were milling the behavior Harlan had described in his broadcasts as congregation, which he theorized was a response to ambient sound. The infected drawn to the low-frequency noise of idling engines or settling metal or wind through broken windows, and then remaining because the congregation itself generated the stimulus that sustained it. Our route required crossing that highway. I sat on the ridge with my map and my binoculars, and I studied the terrain the way I'd studied 1,000 terrain features from 1,000 office chairs, except now the contour lines were under my boots, and the abstraction had become a problem with a 13-year-old and 2 dogs attached to it. The crossing point I'd planned was directly through the congregation zone. The next viable crossing was 4 miles east, adding a full day to our traverse. A day we didn't have, because Harlan's storm was now visible as a wall of cloud advancing from the southwest, and the temperature had dropped 9 degrees since morning. Oren solved it. He was sitting apart from us, drawing in his notebook, the one he'd been maintaining since the vault, filled with his versions of Harlan's situation maps. And without looking up, he said, "There's a rail grade." I looked at his map. He'd drawn it from memory. The Southern Pacific Rail line that once ran through the Santiam Pass corridor, abandoned in the 1980s when the timber economy collapsed. The grade still existed as a linear cut through the terrain, running roughly parallel to the highway but 200 feet higher in elevation, and screened by a continuous embankment of fill material that the railroad had used to maintain its gentle gradient across the mountain slope. It was on my maps. I'd seen it 100 times. I'd never thought to walk on it because it wasn't a road, wasn't a trail, wasn't anything a cartographer would designate as a route. It was infrastructure residue, dead contour. But Oren saw it as a path because he wasn't a cartographer. He didn't read maps the way I did, as systems of established symbols. He read them the way his mother must have read them, as terrain containing possibilities that the symbols hadn't captured yet. We crossed the pass on the rail grade in 4 hours, 200 feet above the congregation zone, screened by the embankment, close enough to hear the infected below us. That shuffling, uneven cadence, punctuated by vocalizations that weren't speech and weren't quite anything else. A sound I will carry in my inner ear for as long as that ear functions. Zip froze twice. Sextant pressed against my leg with a constant low tremor that I felt through my pant leg like a current. Celia walked with her good hand on Oren's shoulder, and her damaged hand carrying a length of rebar she'd taken from the vault and never mentioned until I saw it in her grip on the embankment. Nobody spoke. Speaking would have been sound, and sound was the one resource we could not spend. On the far side of the pass, the terrain opened into the high desert of central Oregon. Juniper and sage and pumice soil, stretching east toward a horizon line I hadn't seen in 25 days of forest and concrete. The openness was disorienting. After weeks of canopy and walls, the sky was an unmanageable amount of information. I caught myself looking up and feeling the specific vertigo of a man whose spatial references have suddenly expanded beyond his calibration. Redmond was 21 miles northeast. We had 2 days. The storm caught us on day 5, 12 miles from the airfield. It came faster than Harlan's models predicted. Or maybe his models were accurate, and we were slower than I'd calculated. Which amounts to the same thing when you're walking through horizontal rain at 4,100 feet with hypothermia as a real-time threat rather than an abstract entry in a survival manual. The temperature dropped to 34 degrees. The rain mixed with sleet. Oren's improvised pack harness soaked through and the weight shifted, and I watched him stumble 3 times in an hour before Celia redistributed his load across her own shoulders without asking or explaining. We reached a Forest Service equipment shed at dusk, a corrugated metal structure with a broken padlock, and a concrete floor and enough roof to stop the rain. Inside, we found what abandoned infrastructure always contains: rust, mouse droppings, the particular loneliness of a place built for a purpose it no longer serves. Also a 50-gallon drum of diesel fuel, a wall-mounted first aid kit missing everything except gauze and tape, and a faded evacuation map of the Deschutes National Forest, tacked to the wall with pushpins. I studied that map while Celia wrapped Oren in every dry layer we had left. It was a standard agency production. I recognized the cartographic style because it was mine. Not literally mine, but my department's, my conventions, my symbol set. Someone in my office had drawn this map, maybe years ago, and it had ended up here on this wall in this shed that was now the difference between my companions surviving the night or not. I pinned one of my hand-drawn vault maps to the wall beside it, took a pushpin from the evacuation map, and pressed my map into the same surface, my lines next to lines that could have been drawn by my own hand at a different desk on a different Tuesday. Celia watched me do it. "You're giving it away," she said. "I'm putting it on the map." Same thing. It was. That was moral dilemma 3. Every copy I left broadened the circle of people who could find the vault, and every addition to that circle diluted the vault's capacity to save any one of them. A shelter that can sustain 4 for 6 months becomes a shelter that sustains 8 for 3 months, or 16 for 6 weeks. And at some point, the math converges on a number indistinguishable from 0. I was a cartographer. I understood scale. I understood that the act of mapping a hidden place is the act of unhiding it, and that unhiding is irreversible. But a map that stays in one man's pocket is just a way of owning the ground without standing on it. And I'd owned enough things that way. I'd owned my marriage that way, kept the precise accounting of what was mine and what was owed, and what the measurements showed. And the measurements had shown a man alone in a duplex with a dog. The rain broke before dawn. We walked the last 12 miles in 8 hours through air that smelled like wet juniper and ozone, arriving at the perimeter of Redmond Municipal Airport at 3:47 p.m. on day 30 of the outbreak. The National Guard was there. Not in force. A company-sized element, maybe 120 soldiers, operating from the terminal building, and a cluster of tents on the tarmac. 2 C-130s sat on the runway, both showing hard use. The screening process was what Harlan had described. Medical examination, 48-hour observation in a quarantine tent. Then transport south. A sergeant with a clipboard and a face that hadn't slept in approximately the same number of days as mine checked our names and asked if we had weapons. I surrendered the Remington. Celia surrendered her rebar. Orrin surrendered a folding knife I hadn't known he was carrying. Dogs, the sergeant said, looking at Sextant and Zip. Non-negotiable, Celia said in her charge nurse voice. He looked at her, looked at the dogs, wrote something on his clipboard. They let the dogs through. In the quarantine tent, waiting for the blood draws and the temperature checks and the observation period that would determine whether we flew south or didn't, Orrin unfolded his map, the one he'd drawn from Harlan's broadcasts, and showed it to a lieutenant who'd come through to brief the incoming survivors. The lieutenant looked at it for a long time. Then he asked Orrin where he'd learned to draw like that. My mom, Orrin said. The lieutenant took the map, not confiscated, requested. He asked if Orrin could produce more. Orrin said he could if someone gave him a radio and a pencil. 3 weeks later, at the relocation center in Redding, California, I found Orrin sitting at a folding table in the communications tent, headphones on, drawing. He had 6 maps pinned to the wall. Each one showed a different sector of the Oregon Cascades, annotated with Harlan's reports and supplemented with terrain data Orrin was pulling from USGS sheets the National Guard had in their reference library. A staff sergeant stood behind him, watching, occasionally pointing at a feature and asking a question that Orrin answered without looking up. The boy was a cartographer. I stood in the entrance of that tent, and I felt the weight of something I couldn't draw. The topography of what gets passed from one person to the next, not through genetics or instruction, but through proximity, through the simple fact of being in the same room while someone demonstrates that precision is a form of love. Celia found me there. She'd taken a nursing position at the center's medical unit. Her hand had healed with a scar she traced sometimes with her opposite thumb, the way a person touches a rosary, not examining it, just confirming it's still there. You're staring, she said. I'm surveying. She almost smiled. Not quite. A contour in the terrain of her face that indicated the elevation was changing, but hadn't resolved into a definitive feature. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the last copy of my vault map, the one I'd kept for myself, folded into quarters, soft at the creases from 30 days of carrying. I looked at it the way you look at something you've been holding so tightly, your hand has forgotten it's there. Then I walked to the communications board and pinned it up with the public postings, the survivor registries, the supply requests, the hand-drawn directions to water points and latrine blocks, and the chapel tent where a chaplain held services every evening for anyone who needed to sit in a room with other people and be quiet together. One more map. One more copy of a place no map was supposed to show, now visible to anyone passing a bulletin board in a camp in Northern California. Sextant leaned against my leg. I put my hand on his head. The fur was warm and slightly oily, and exactly the temperature of a living thing that has chosen, through no logic I can map, to remain beside you. That evening, I sat on a cot in a canvas tent and opened my notebook to a fresh page. At the top I wrote, Survey Notes, Redding Relocation Center, Day 1. And then I began to draw the place I was in, the way I'd drawn every place I'd ever been, carefully, honestly, line by line, because the ground is always there, and the only question is whether someone is willing to tell the truth about its shape. This is a story about maps, but it's really a story about who we keep things for. I wrote it because I've been thinking about information hoarding, the instinct to keep what we know locked in our own pockets, because sharing it means losing control of it. We do this with knowledge, with resources, with love. We convince ourselves that the thing we're protecting has value precisely because it's private. And we forget that a map nobody reads is just ink on paper. It doesn't become a map until someone follows it. The survival vault in this story is fictional, but the Cold War continuity caches are real. The federal government seeded thousands of emergency supply points across the American landscape between 1952 and 1991. Most were decommissioned. Some were forgotten. A few still sit in the woods, unlabeled, maintained by no one, waiting for a crisis that their builders assumed would come from the sky rather than from our own biology. I find that haunting. Infrastructure built for the wrong apocalypse, potentially useful for the right one, invisible because no one transferred the paperwork to digital. 3 questions for you. First, the practical one. If you found a survival cache stocked for 4 people and you were alone, what would determine who you told? Location, trust, need? Would you tell anyone at all? Second, the moral one. Grant maps the vault knowing every copy reduces its capacity to save any individual group. Celia says giving it away and putting it on a map are the same thing. Is she right? Is there a meaningful difference between generosity and disclosure? Third, the personal one. What are you keeping in your pocket right now? Knowledge, a skill, a truth about yourself. That would mean more to someone else if you let it out into the world. And what's stopping you? Thank you for listening. 3 hours of your attention is not nothing. I treated it like territory worth mapping accurately because it is.